All right, we are recording. Put the screen up. There we go. Somebody have birds?
Yeah, that's me. They're outside. They've been chirping like a lot now lately.
No, yeah, it's their springtime. No, it's fine. I was just curious. It almost sounded like it was indoors, but that was like at I was just talking to the what is it? Who was it? Naomi at the Clark's house. They got a bunch of noisy birds too.
Oh yeah.
Okay, let's see. Okay, what's our topic?
Fall of the Berlin Wall.
Fall of the Berlin Wall. Okay, what's our year? When did that thing come crashing down?
1989?
1989.
Ooh,
Actually, we've hit my lifetime. I was born. I was alive. You guys not yet. We'll get there. Another 2 weeks, but we're actually into living history for me. So we got 3 topics here. Fall of the Berlin Wall. It's basically a story of communism and the Cold War. So if you're writing your intro, this is the story of the Cold War. The fall of the Berlin Wall marks the end of that Cold War. But we're talking about the world conflict that emerged after World War II. A lot of people think, oh, World War II ended and everything went nice and good. And in some ways it did. But there was a pretty serious conflict going on for the next several decades between the United States and the Soviet Union. And so that's what we're talking about. So we got Iron Curtain, next paragraph, War of Ideas, and then finally, Evil Empire. Evil Empire. Okay, we'll start with Iron Curtain, and I'll fill in an A, B, and C for the next 2 once we get there. What does the Iron Curtain refer to?
the Berlin Wall?
The Berlin Wall would have been part of it, but what you want to talk about here is it refers to the fact that after World War II, and again, we think, oh, World War II ended and everybody got set free and Germany had to rebuild and Japan had to rebuild. But what a lot of people don't realize is you had Germany that was conquered by, what 2 nations conquered Germany? Invaded Germany?
Western Europe and then the Soviet Union.
Yeah, you had the United, we'll just say the United States. The United
Teachers, there is a little parade outside for you.
Oh, I'm getting an announcement.
In the parking lot, so if you want to go outside real quickly and wave, I think that would be appreciated. Thank you.
The United States and Britain invaded half of Germany, and the Soviet Union invaded the other half. So when the war ends, the United States and the Allies, they retreat, or they free the nations that they invaded because they were just trying to set them free. But the Soviet Union basically just keeps everything. The Soviet Union, all the countries that it invaded, including like Poland and Eastern Europe and Latvia, and anyway, all these Eastern European countries and Germany, they use it as an excuse to take control of those countries. They eventually say, oh, we're leaving them, but they basically put puppet governments in their place. And so this first idea of totalitarian continues. We defeat the totalitarian Nazis, but the totalitarian communists actually end up using World War II to take a lot of control. And so the end of World War II isn't as nice and tied up as a lot of times we think. The Soviets don't give their territory back. Some of the other governments, the Ukraine, Sam's country, the Ukraine is left under communist control. Bulgaria, Poland, all those Eastern European countries. Soviet Union saw World War II as a chance to.
A false call, sorry. So hopefully you needed a break.
Sorry.
And then,
used it as an excuse to take territory. So that's why World War II is basically the launching point of a bigger war called the Cold War. And so that term Iron Curtain comes from Winston Churchill. What country is Winston Churchill from?
Great Britain.
Yeah, he's from Great Britain. He basically he looks at the map of Europe, and Europe is basically split in half between the countries that were freed by the Americans and the British, and then the other countries that were quote unquote freed by the Soviet Union, but now are under their control. And he says that dividing line has become an iron curtain between totalitarian communistic countries and free democratic countries. And he kind of predicts that the next conflict of the world is this thing called the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, which are really the only remaining superpowers after World War II. Europe as a whole is in shambles. They're so weakened. Europe was absolutely devastated. Their cities, their economies, everything. And so the United States and the Soviet Union are kind of like the last two superpowers standing. And they, of course, do not see eye to eye. They were only friends because they were both attacked by Hitler. There's nothing in their ideologies that would make a communist, totalitarian country be an ally with a democratic capitalist country. And so once Germany was out of the way, they basically saw each other as competition. And so that's what we call the Cold War, following World War II. 1949 is kind of considered the beginning of the Cold War for two reasons. What kind of terrifying technology did the U.S. end World War II with?
The atom bombs.
Yeah, the atomic weapon. And so for the time, the U.S., the war ended in 1945. And so for 4 years, the United States was the sole nation on earth with atomic weapons. However, 1949 changed that because the Soviet Union had spies within the Manhattan Project, and they very quickly stole the secrets of the atomic bomb, and they were able to build their own nuclear weapons. And so 1949, the Soviet Union explodes its first atomic bomb. And so people kind of mark that as the moment the Cold War begins, because now the Soviet Union has the same terrible weaponry that the United States has. And so now they're kind of mutually balanced in opposition to each other with nuclear weapons. The other thing that kind of announces the beginning of the Cold War in 1949 is that another very large country goes communist. In fact, the most populous country on earth. And that really shakes the United States, because they realize now when they're resisting communism, it's not just the Soviet Union, it's this other country. What country is that? What other major country becomes communist on our planet? Can you imagine? With a huge population.
China?
China. Yep. China goes communist. Russia had been communist since the end of World War I. China falls to communism in 1949 with their leader Mao Zedong. So we got the atomic bomb, and then you've got China under Mao Zedong here. And so now, again, communism seems like it's spreading. And again, the most populous country in the world is now communist. That the US is realizing, you know what, we're going to have to resist this, or else we're going to end up being completely outnumbered and surrounded by this dangerous form of government and ideology. So a lot of people mark 1949 as the beginning of the Cold War. Okay, any questions for that first paragraph? Okay, we're going to talk about the War of Ideas. And let me just put up the things here. Okay, so War of Ideas. That's kind of, when you talk about what the Berlin Wall represents, is they represent two very opposite ways of living life. I've already said it. The two chief components of the United States, we say our government is a form of democracy, and our economy is capitalism. Both of those involve free individual people. Democracy means free individual people get to participate in their government, and capitalism means I get to use my resources, my property, my money to make money, and then I get to keep that money. I get to keep the fruits of my labor for myself, and I have my own house and my own car, and I have my salary, and that might not be the same as somebody else, but it's mine. And so it's an idea built upon individualism and individual freedom and individual sovereignty. That's what the United States represents, along with Great Britain and the West in the Cold War, versus the other opposing ideas is those of the Soviet Union, which is totalitarian, which means the government should have total control of the main aspects of society. And then communism, which is, no, you don't get to have private property. There's no such thing as private property. Everything you have, you share in common with your fellow men throughout your country. And so you work and you earn and you make things for the common good, and then you get handed out the same as everybody else. And now that's equal and utopian and, supposedly very good. And so these are the two opposing ideas, free individuals versus state control. And that's what's really at stake. And that's why I'm saying there's really not a lot of room for the United States to be friends with the Soviet Union after the war. We're finding out the same thing with China right now, that as much as we've begun to trade with and interact with China and tried to make them our friend, we're realizing their communist totalitarian government and what they've, the stuff they've done around this virus and lied about it and helped it spread and different things. They're really realizing they're two different worldviews that's very hard for them to coexist. Two other ways to look at these worldviews is one is just the faith aspect, that the West is one nation under God, freedom under God. We're free without because we're being ruled by God within, whereas communism in its very declaration is atheistic. There is no God but the state. And so there's no freedom of religion under communism. That's why you're getting church crackdowns in China. And then you had that reading from the Soviet Union about the pastor being arrested because he's trying to secretly have church out in the woods, because they cannot let you worship a power higher than the government. Okay, so you have freedom under God versus atheistic materialism. You have Western civilization versus God kings. Communism is basically another form of God kings. It's just like Pharaoh back at the very beginning of time, or just like the Roman emperors. A man ruling other men as their ultimate source of purpose, as their God, basically. And so the stakes are big. This is a major conflict, even though it doesn't get as much press as things like World War II. Why was it called a Cold War? Because it was fought in Siberia, up in cold Russia, or why was it a Cold War?
Oh, it was because it's not an actual war, but it could have turned into a war at any moment.
Hey, very good. Absolutely. Yeah. The United States and the Soviet Union never outright fight each other the way we fought the Nazis or fought the Japanese. It was a war of culture. It was a war of ideas. And yeah, they could have, it was always a threat, that one would attack the other and that nuclear weapons would be fired. But that's actually one reason they never did it, is because of the nuclear weapons. There's a term called MAD, M-A-D. I'll put that up here. And that stands for mutually assured destruction. Mutually assured destruction. And that meant if any of either the US or the Soviet Union was foolish enough to launch nuclear weapons at the other one would have time to fire theirs back before they were destroyed. And so basically the US and the Soviet Union knew if they ever went at each other all out, they would basically destroy each other. And they would lay waste to one another's cities with horrible things like that we saw in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so that, mutually assured destruction basically meant, hey, I know we can never fight each other directly because we'll destroy each other. So the way that they fight the war is through these things called proxy wars, which basically means they fight through other smaller nations trying to decide if they're going to be democratic or communistic. And so they're never fighting each other directly, but they're kind of like supporting third countries. And this is what happens in Berlin. You saw the video about the candy bomber, where again, the Soviet Union is trying to starve the city so that it surrenders and it becomes fully communistic. The US isn't going to launch fighter jets and start killing Russian troops, but they will start dropping food supplies into Berlin so that they can survive the siege. So again, they're fighting each other, but not outrightly in a hot way, kind of in a subtle, passive-aggressive, cold way. Korea, the war in Korea is an example of this. The war in Vietnam, Cuba. These are all little hot spots where there's fights between communist and democratic forces, and the Soviet Union supports one side and the United States fights the other side. So that's important to kind of explain why we call it a Cold War. And again, it doesn't mean people didn't die. Again, we lose about 40 or 50,000 people in Korea. We lose about 60,000 in Vietnam. There are deaths, but it's never directly against the Soviet Union, and it's never on a full all-out scale. Because we know MAD is out there, and we don't want anybody, we don't want to ever get to the point of actually launching nuclear weapons. Okay. This last idea here is one of détente. And what détente means is coexistence. And in telling the story of the Cold War, this is kind of an important moment because do anybody know the only war the US has ever lost?
Is it the Cold War?
No, we're actually going to win the Cold War because that Berlin Wall is going to fall and Berlin's going to become free. So we're going to win this war, but there's one of these proxy wars that we lose.
Oh, the Vietnam War.
The Vietnam War. The Vietnam War is one war where what the U.S. was pushing for, a free or at least a split state. Like Korea is half communist, half free today. There's North and South Korea because the U.S. fought there and achieved that goal. They tried to do the same thing in Vietnam. It did not work. The U.S. withdrew, and today all of Vietnam is communist. The reason I bring that up is because that failure in Vietnam, along with other things going on, really caused the U.S. to question if they should be fighting the Cold War. Should they be trying to resist this totalitarian communism? And I would say a very kind of dangerous, defeated idea emerged. And this is in the whoops, let me fix that. This is in the 1960s and 70s. And this is the idea that, you know what, we just have to coexist with communism rather than trying to defeat it, rather than saying it's evil, rather than saying people should live free. We should just get along with it and just kind of coexist and de-escalate. And a lot of people, because they'd seen what happened in Vietnam, and there was Korea and there was these other issues, they said, you know, let's just learn to get along with the Soviet Union and communist China rather than fight them and try to say our way, our freedoms and our democracy are better. In some ways, people thought, oh, that's good. It feels like there's less tension. Other people said, well, look, you're just too tired of fighting. You're not willing to sacrifice anymore, and you're letting these regimes, which again, the communists in the Soviet Union killed about 40 million of their own people. Mao in China killed somewhere between 70 and 100 million of his own people to achieve his communist revolution. So these are wicked, wicked ideologies, but with the defeat in Vietnam, and again, the fact that this is not a war of a couple years. World War II the U.S. fights for 4 years. This is decades. This starts in 1949. And so you can see by the 1960s and 70s, the U.S. has been doing this for about 20 and 30 years. People are kind of over it. And so they say, you know what, let's just coexist and get along. We don't have the right to try to defeat communism. Maybe we're no better. You even had communists in the United States saying democracy isn't as good as communism. We should just actually go over to their side. And so this is kind of the dark moment of the story we're telling, where the U.S. really questions itself and says, maybe our worldview isn't worth fighting for. Okay, any questions on that?
Nope.
Okay, so all that changes in the 1980s. And that's where this is going to get us up to the fall of the Berlin Wall, because we get two leaders. We get Ronald Reagan and, if I can spell it right, and Margaret Thatcher. Ronald Reagan is obviously the elected president of the United States in 1980. Margaret Thatcher is the prime minister in Great Britain. And the reason they're important is because they basically reject détente. They say, you know what? The fact that the U.S. is going to go into decline, the fact that the U.S. should just coexist, the fact that the U.S. is no better than these communist nations, and we have no right to try to resist them, they say that's a lie. And they basically stir up the argument again for U.S. pride and say, you know what? No, democracy, freedom of individuals, the right of people to work for themselves and to keep their own property, that is a human right. That is a good thing. And they take what's called the moral high ground and they say, you know what? We're going to defeat the Soviet Union. Their system is not as good. You can't say a system that enslaves people and imprisons people for dissent and doesn't allow freedom of religion and doesn't allow people to keep the fruits of their labor. They're like, you can't say that's just as good as what we have here in the West. And so they reject compromise and say, we're going to win the Cold War. And the reason we call this evil empires, that's actually a term coined by Ronald Reagan. Is he says, you know, I'm not going to coexist with an evil empire. And people thought, oh, you can't call it an evil empire. And he goes, yeah, look at what it does to its own people. That's also an 80s reference because a very influential movie came out in 1980. Does anybody know? The first one came out in 1977, and part 2, or episode 5, came out in 1980, called The Empire Strikes Back. And so Reagan, being a movie star, he seizes on that and says, you know what, that evil empire in Star Wars, these Star Wars movies, that's the Soviet Union. They're the bad guys. Let's not forget they're the bad guys. Not their form of government is the bad guy, not the people themselves, but the communist government is evil. And so three things you want to say that these two people did. Number one, what I just said, they restored confidence that what they were fighting for was worth fighting for. If you don't think your sports team is better than the other sports team, then there's not really going to be a game. You're not going to win. Even if you're the better player, you're not going to win if you don't think it's worth winning. That's what they brought back, a return of confidence. The second thing is they said, we are going to outcompete. We're going to prove that we're better. We're going to outcompete. Instead of having a smaller military, we're going to have a bigger military. And when the Soviet Union tries to keep up, they're going to fall apart. And so they sought military competition as far as developing new military technologies. And then the most famous is this thing called SDI. I'll go ahead and write this and this was in your notes. Does anybody remember what SDI is?
Space Defense Initiative.
Yes, the Space Defense Initiative. And you guys, if you remember MAD, that's why MAD's an important part of the story, is one reason we couldn't openly oppose the Soviet Union militarily was because, hey, we'll just destroy each other. Well, Reagan goes, well, forget that. We're innovators here. We're creative. We're free. The human mind, the individual human spirit can conquer that. He goes, you know what we're going to do? We're going to go into space, and we're going to invent satellites. And these satellites are going to be able to, we're going to create a missile shield so that the Soviet Union launches missiles at us. Our satellites are going to shoot it down. And then our missiles can go and destroy them. And so SDI was a challenge to MAD, basically saying, you know what, we're going to change the game. And all of a sudden, the Soviets won't be able to hit us with nuclear weapons, but we'll still be able to hit them. And so we're going to have the strategic advantage. That really scared the Soviet Union because they realized if the US does that, they have the advantage, and they could not compete with that. Because secondarily, at the same time, the Soviet Union can't sustain itself. The Soviet Union by the 1980s is in decline. The Soviet Union is feeding itself by buying food from the United States. The Soviet Union has some of the richest farmland in the world. In your country there, Sam, the Ukraine, and yet because of their economic system, they're not making the most of it, and they can't even feed themselves. And they're only able to feed their people because the U.S. is willing to sell them food. And so this is stuff Reagan saw and said, look, who can say we're better systems when they can't even feed their own people? And the only way they invented the nuclear weapon was because they stole it from us. And so the Soviet Union is just too big. They're having shortages. They can't innovate. When you're not free, when you're just told what to do, and no matter what you do, it's not going to benefit you personally, you're not going to get very creative. You're not going to come up with new ideas. And so the level of technological advancement in the United States compared to the communist countries was nothing. And so they were suffering from lack of innovation, and the fact that the only way they maintained control was through fear and lies, propaganda. People in Soviet Union weren't allowed to watch American media. Just like in China today, they can't go on Facebook, they can't go on YouTube, they can't go on Google without certain filters because communist regimes are built upon lying to their people and controlling the truth. And so all of these things, again, since 1949, so what are we? We're about 30 years out, the Soviet Union is weak. And then when they see Reagan and Thatcher show up and they're like, you know what, we're going to turn up the heat, we're going to build our militaries, we are the better ideology, and we're going to invent SDI, the Soviet Union really begins to collapse in on itself. And so then that leads us to a guy named Mikhail Gorbachev and two key ideas: perestroika, I'm going to write these out because they're Russian words, and glasnost. Okay. Mikhail Gorbachev becomes the leader of the Soviet Union around the same time as Ronald Reagan. And he, seeing the weakness of his own country and the confidence and the determination of the United States and Britain under Thatcher and Reagan, basically says, you know what, we can't keep doing this. We have to change. The Soviet Union has to change. And so he institutes two policies. Perestroika is Russian for political reform or restructuring. He basically says we're going to have to allow people more of a vote, more of a say in the government. We can't just keep ruling through fear and oppression. And the moment they start to do that, the Soviet Union begins to collapse. Countries like the Ukraine, countries like Belarus, countries like Bulgaria and Poland, Turkey, they start to break away from the Soviet Union, because once they actually let the people vote for what they want, hey, it turns out they don't want to be communist. Turns out they don't want to be part of the Soviet Union, and they start to break away. The other thing is glasnost. That's another Russian word, and that means openness. And that means he's going to start opening up the Soviet Union to trade and information. And I was just talking about how they have to have propaganda in these countries, and they can't really tell their people the truth. He says, well, let's change that. And again, once they start to let people listen to American radio, watch American TV, watch Western movies, listen to Western news, and have access to information, that destroys the stability of the Soviet Union. And so glasnost and perestroika, political reform and openness of information, really crack open the Soviet Union, and it collapses. And that's what happens in 1989. That's what's going on in Berlin, which again, Berlin was cut and literally divided in half by that wall, where you had the free West and you had the communist East. And hopefully you watched that cartoon or the video where it just showed how desperately the people in the East wanted to escape to the West. Well, once Gorbachev starts to institute perestroika and glasnost, there's a moment where they push through and they overwhelm the guards and they start tearing down the wall, and Germany ends up being reunited, I think, in 1990. We're so used to thinking of Germany as a single country, whereas for 30 years there were two Germanys. There was West Germany and there was East Germany. The fall of the Berlin Wall represents the reunification of Germany and the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1980s, the result of what Reagan and Margaret Thatcher did. So that's kind of why that's our title, and that's what we're building to throughout this story, from beginning to end. And so the collapse of the Berlin Wall represents the end of the Cold War, because the Soviet Union is dissolved, and it goes from being the Soviet Union to free independent countries, and then it goes back to people are calling it Russia again. And today we have the Russian Federation instead of the Soviet Union, because it's no longer communist. So the West definitely wins the Cold War, I'd say, with a big help, largely with Reagan and Thatcher. Anybody need any clarifications or questions? All right, we'll just keep going so you can be done. All right. The key to U.S. victory: believing in its principles. The United States will not fail as long as we believe in who we are. The Western civilization, if it believes in what it is, freedom of the individual, rationality, the sovereignty of God, man's individual potential, free markets, capitalism, if we hold to those principles, the West, there's no opposing it. And détente in the middle of this represents kind of a questioning of that. And that's when we're vulnerable. The Bible says a house, if it's unified, cannot fall. But once a house is divided against itself, once it doesn't believe what that house stands for anymore, that's when it will be defeated. Western civilization and the United States will never be defeated as long as its house is united and it believes in Western civilization and all the things we've been talking about this whole year: political, economic, religious freedom. And that's what all Ronald Reagan and Thatcher did, was say, you know what, we believe in that. We're going to fight for that. The other big takeaway is that, even bigger, is that the truth always wins. Sometimes people say that they look at China and they worry about the U.S., losing to China. And if you're asked, what would happen? Do you think China's going to overtake the United States as a world power and all this different stuff? And I always say the two things we're talking about here. I say, no, not if the U.S. sticks with its principles. And two, why? Because the truth always wins. And when I say the truth, what I mean is God is real. So I don't think a nation that rejects God will ever ultimately win out over a nation that's under God. Freedom, that human beings were made to be free and to think and to have freedom of conscience and freedom of belief and freedom of thought and freedom of speech and freedom to defend their families and hopefully in a few, freedom to go outside and assemble however we want. And the individual sovereignty, that people ultimately should be able to rule themselves. And so if you have two nations and one believes in those things and the other doesn't, I would put all my money on the nation that believes in those things, so long as that nation actually does stick to its principles. Anyway, and so that's kind of what the Cold War shows. The U.S. itself questioned whether it could win the war. Reagan was a great leader and Thatcher were great leaders because they reminded us, no, the stuff our nation, our civilization is built upon, going all the way back to Greece and Rome and Judaism and Christianity and the Glorious Revolution and the Enlightenment and the Middle Ages, everything we're built upon, that's truth, and truth is always going to win. The truth will always come out. You can try to fight truth for a little while, but in the long run, what is true is always going to win. And I think the Cold War is a kind of an important example of that principle. Okay, any questions? No, it's just me talking to myself for a while, but anybody need any clarification? Want to encourage you guys. Oh, go ahead. Somebody gonna say something? I know, I don't know if anybody watched the video yesterday that I put out, the greeting, but I know it's getting a little bit of a drag. I'm sure it's kind of getting old doing this again and again without being able to see each other. But I just want to encourage you to finish strong. We only have 3 more to do, 3 more weeks. And actually really more like 2, because then we'll be wrapping things up that last week. So you're so close. So as you're writing your summaries or as you're doing whatever for your other classes, just finish strong. Anybody watch the track videos I sent out, the races? You see the one video, you see that guy from Oregon celebrating his win. He puts his hands up, he's cheering, and he hasn't crossed the finish line yet, and he gets overtaken at the last second. Or the other one where the girl comes from like 8th place all the way around to win. Anyway, just encourage you guys, finish strong. I know it gets old. I know you're probably kind of over it, but keep doing good work. It'll pay off. And in the meantime, learn to surf or something like Wyatt is. There's still opportunity to do our best and do some other fun stuff. Okay, anybody out there? Go ahead and close off the share here.
Thank you for the lesson today.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
Sure.
thank you.
Yep, you're very welcome.
Thank you.
I appreciate you guys showing up.
Mhm.
Yeah, I miss you guys. If we did like a baseball game or something here, would any of you guys be interested in that? Or a different sport or other excuse to get together?
Maybe.
Video
Yeah.
game tournament in all the different classrooms? Anyway, if you have ideas like that, I mean, even that's actually not a bad idea, like a big old Mario Kart tournament, or I don't know what game everybody would want to play. Set people up in the different classrooms. Well, I don't know what's still cool. I don't know what everybody's still playing. But send me your ideas, because that would be pretty cool. We could do something like that.
We can play Minecraft Battle Royale.
But it'd be good. We're finding an excuse to get together one more time. Anybody seen a good movie they recommend?
Cool Runnings.
Cool Runnings. Ah, yes. I just showed. I can't remember if I said this in my last class or not, or this one, but my kids just saw Rise of Skywalker for the first time, so they're pretty pumped. anybody seen that movie Knives Out? I don't know if that's something you guys have seen or not. There's like a mystery called, I don't know, if you like mystery, there's a movie called Knives Out. That's pretty good. But all right, I'm going to stop recording.